When the call came through about the missing campers, it didn't sound unusual. Hikers getting turned around, groups losing track of time. It happened, especially out in the hollow stretch, a remote area of the park that few people ever ventured into. The terrain was steep, the trails poorly marked, and the trees grew so densely that they seemed to form walls. The group had been missing for 3 days, a family of 4, parents in their 40s, 2 teenagers. Their car was still parked at the ranger station, a thin layer of pine needles covering the bonnet. Their permits showed they'd planned a 3-day loop through the stretch. They should have been back the evening before. I was tasked with searching the area along with 2 others. We started near the trailhead where their route would have begun. The undergrowth was thicker than I remembered, the trees so close together that the light barely made it through. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten even when you were standing in the middle of it. It wasn't long before we found their campsite. Everything was perfectly intact. The tents were still pitched, the firewood stacked neatly beside a ring of stones. Inside, sleeping bags were rolled out and backpacks were propped in the corners, zippers closed. A single cup sat on a folding chair near the fire pit, half full of what looked like water. There was no sign of the family. We searched the surrounding area, calling out and scanning the forest, but the silence pressed back at us. It wasn't the kind of quiet you normally get in the woods with birdsong and rustling leaves in the background. It was deeper than that, like the forest was holding its breath. I checked the gear again, trying to make sense of it. Food was still packed away in airtight containers. Their maps were spread out on a small table, marked with pencil lines tracing the route they'd planned to take. None of it looked disturbed. It was as if they'd all stepped out for a moment and forgotten to come back. We marked the site and decided to split up, covering more ground before the sun dipped too low. I took the east trail, a narrow path that twisted through a maze of birches and pines. As I moved further in, the trees seemed to close in tighter. My torch barely cut through the dim light, and the air felt thick against my skin. The trail faded into patches of moss and dirt, and I found myself relying more on instinct than any visible markers. Then I noticed the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the buzz of a far-off engine. It didn't have a source, at least not one I could pinpoint. It came and went in waves, humming through the trees. I thought about turning back, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and I wasn't sure which way I'd come. I pressed on, scanning the ground for footprints or any sign of the family. The buzzing grew louder, and I realized my torch was flickering. The beam of light stuttered and dimmed, then flared back to life. I smacked it against my palm, cursing under my breath. When the torch flickered again, it didn't come back. I was left standing in near darkness, the outlines of trees barely visible against the grey sky. That was when I noticed the light. It wasn't my torch, it was something else, faint and bluish, glowing in the distance. It pulsed softly, casting an eerie glow across the forest floor. I moved towards it, drawn by something I couldn't name. The light led me to a clearing I didn't recognize, though I'd been in the hollow stretch more times than I could count. The ground was bare, no moss or grass, just a patch of dirt that seemed to swallow the light. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its trunk twisted and blackened, as though struck by lightning. The light pulsed around it, growing stronger, brighter, until it hurt to look at. And then it went out. I don't remember how I got back to the campsite. One moment I was standing in the clearing, and the next I was stumbling through the trees. The tent suddenly in front of me, my legs felt weak, and there was a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth. The others were there waiting. They looked at me like I'd gone mad when I told them what I'd seen. One of them checked his watch and frowned. I asked him what was wrong, and he said I'd been gone for nearly 3 hours. I didn't argue, but it didn't make sense. The clearing couldn't have been more than a kilometer away. We decided to head back to the station and regroup, leaving the gear where it was. The hike out felt longer than it should have. The trails seemed to twist in directions they hadn't before, the trees crowding in like walls. When we finally reached the station, the radio crackled to life. Another team had found something, a shoe lodged in a stream several kilometers away from the campsite. It belonged to the youngest of the family. We went back the next day, combing the area near the stream. The buzzing sound was back, faint and insistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the search, but it seemed to follow us, always just on the edge of hearing. Then the gaps began. One moment I'd be walking, the sound of my boots crunching against the ground. The next I'd be standing somewhere else with no memory of having moved. It wasn't just me, the others experienced it too. We'd lose minutes at a time, blinking and finding ourselves in places we didn't recognize. The campsite was gone when we returned to it. The tents, the gear, everything had vanished, leaving nothing but an empty patch of ground. We reported what had happened, but no one believed us. The official story was that the family had gotten lost, their disappearance chalked up to poor planning and bad luck. But I can't stop thinking about the clearing, the twisted tree and the blue light that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I don't go near the hollow stretch anymore. I don't even look at it on the map. The buzzing hasn't stopped. I'd been on shift for 10 days when the fire came. 10 days of long, quiet hours in the tower, perched above the tree line with nothing but binoculars and a two-way radio for company. The air was dry the way it always was in late summer, and the trees stretched out below me in an endless sea of green, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop. The lookout tower was basic, a wooden structure with a single room at the top and a rickety staircase winding down to the forest floor. There was a cot shoved against one wall, a small desk with a map spread out on it, and a metal cabinet holding supplies. The windows gave a panoramic view of the park, though it all blurred together after a while. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up, the light outside had changed. It wasn't the golden glow of evening or the soft haze of dawn. It was red, a deep, angry red that didn't belong. My throat was dry and the air smelled sharp like burnt pine needles. I stumbled to the window, blinking against the brightness. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose into the sky, black and thick, curling upwards in a way that made my stomach clench. The fire must have started hours ago. I grabbed the binoculars and scanned the horizon, following the smoke down to where it met the trees. The fire wasn't a distant dot on the map. It was closer than it should have been, closer than it had any right to be. The radio crackled when I tried to use it, the signal weak and filled with static. I couldn't tell if anyone was answering, couldn't even make out the words. The fire had already started cutting me off. I threw on my pack and took the metal stairs 2 at a time, my boots clanging against the steps. By the time I hit the ground, the air felt thicker, hotter. The forest was too quiet. Even the birds had gone, leaving nothing but the faint roar of the fire in the distance. I jogged towards the trail, my map tucked into the side pocket of my pack. The path twisted through the trees, the undergrowth dry enough to snap underfoot. Every step sent up tiny clouds of dust. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and something sharper, burning resin maybe, or the bark itself. The fire was moving faster than I expected, driven by the wind and the dry conditions. I reached the first campsite, a small clearing with a fire ring in the center and a handful of tents pitched nearby. The tents were empty, the zippers undone, as though their occupants had left in a hurry. A rucksack lay sprawled on the ground, its contents scattered. I called out, my voice sounding thin against the roar in the distance. No one answered. The fire was close enough now that I could see the glow of it through the trees, an orange line flickering against the dark trunks. The wind shifted again, and embers rained down, small and glowing like fireflies. They landed on the dry pine needles, sparking faintly before winking out. I grabbed a branch and swept the embers away, knowing it wouldn't make much difference. The fire was moving faster than I was. I ran, the map useless in my hand. The trail seemed to twist in ways it hadn't before, the trees crowding closer together. The smoke thickened, stinging my eyes and burning my throat. I reached another clearing, this one larger, with a picnic table in the center and a metal bin for rubbish. There was no sign of people, though footprints crisscrossed the dirt. The fire was closer now, the roar of it louder than my own breathing. The embers came again, falling in thicker clusters, setting fire to the undergrowth. I stomped out the flames where I could, but the fire was faster, jumping from branch to branch, tree to tree. The smoke swallowed the sun, turning the sky an ashen grey. The heat pressed against me, stifling, and I could feel the fire closing in, circling around me. I ran again, the trail disappearing beneath my feet. My lungs burned with each breath, my legs screaming with the effort. The fire line seemed to flicker in every direction, no longer just behind me, but to the sides, cutting off the paths I'd known for years. I reached a creek, the water low but still flowing. I splashed through it, the coolness a brief relief against the heat. The fire hesitated at the edge of the water, crackling and snapping like a living thing. The creek wound through a narrow gully, the rocks slick with moss. I followed it, slipping and stumbling, the roar of the fire still close behind. The smoke hung low here, curling through the trees like mist. The gully opened into another clearing, this one blackened and charred. The trees here were stripped bare, their trunks scorched, the ground covered in ash. The fire had already passed through, leaving nothing but smouldering embers. I stood there, gasping for breath, the heat pressing against my skin. The fire was still behind me, still moving, and the smoke was so thick I could barely see. The clearing stretched out before me, the ash swirling in the air like snow. Beyond it, the trees loomed dark and endless, their trunks disappearing into the haze. I stepped forward into the blackened ground, the heat rising with each step. The fire roared behind me and the smoke swallowed the sky. The day began like most others at the park, damp air hanging around the tree trunks, the faint scent of pine needles crushed underfoot. I was with a small group of rangers tasked with clearing out the northern quadrant, an area that hadn't been properly maintained in years. Overgrowth and fallen branches choked what had once been trails, and the map we were working from was more guesswork than fact. It wasn't the kind of job anyone looked forward to, but it needed doing. There had been complaints about hikers losing their bearings, or worse, stumbling into unstable areas. We worked in pairs, cutting back brush and marking off hazards. It was tedious, but it was straightforward. I wasn't thinking about anything but getting through the day. About 2 hours in, Martin, my partner, spotted it. At first, it just looked like a gap in the trees, a space where the forest thinned unnaturally. As we got closer, I realized it was more than that. The outline of a structure emerged through the greenery, a cabin almost entirely swallowed by the forest. It didn't belong there. That much was clear. The park kept meticulous records of any structures on the property, and this wasn't on the map. The wood was dark with age, the roof slanted and patched with mismatched shingles. Ivy snaked up the sides, and the door hung slightly ajar. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life, but something about the place gave me pause. Martin didn't wait. He stepped ahead and pushed the door open with his boot. It creaked in a way that made me wince, though I couldn't say why. Inside, the light was dim, filtering through warped and filthy windows. The smell hit me immediately, damp wood, and something else, something sour and animal-like. The first thing I noticed was the walls. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned in overlapping layers like scales. Some were old and faded, curling at the edges. Others were recent, printed on glossy paper. All of them showed people. Hikers mostly. Some were smiling, posed in front of landmarks. Others were candid, caught mid-stride on trails or sitting around campfires. I scanned the faces, feeling a prickling at the back of my neck. Many of the pictures were of strangers, but some were recognizable. Regular visitors to the park, people who'd come through in the past few months. One or two I remembered speaking to personally. In the corner of the room was a table piled with notebooks, scraps of paper, and what looked like hand-drawn maps of the park. Some of the maps were annotated, marking locations with dates and crude sketches of tents or vehicles. There was a sound behind us, a rustling, faint but unmistakable. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just the trees pressing close around the cabin, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Martin moved to the back of the cabin, where a trap door was set into the floor. The wood around it was scuffed, the edges worn smooth as though it had been used frequently. He pulled it open, and a damp, earthy smell wafted up. A ladder descended into darkness. I stayed at the top while Martin climbed down, his torch cutting through the gloom below. He called up that there was a storage space. Tools, ropes, tarpaulins. When he came back up, he was carrying a metal box. It was locked, but the edges were rusted, and the lid popped open with a little force. Inside were more photographs, along with small personal items. A silver bracelet, a set of car keys, a wallet. My stomach turned as I recognized one of the items, a bright blue hair clip I'd seen on a girl just a month ago. She had been with her family, laughing as they set off on one of the trails. We stepped outside, the sunlight feeling too bright after the gloom of the cabin. Martin said we needed to radio this in immediately, and I agreed, but as he reached for his pack, his hand froze. He nodded towards the trees, his face pale. Someone was standing there. At first it was hard to make them out. The figure was partially obscured by the undergrowth, but I could tell they were tall, their frame wiry. They didn't move, just stood there, half hidden by the greenery. I could see a flash of something metallic in their hand. A blade, maybe, or a tool. Martin grabbed my arm and gestured for us to move back towards the trail. We weren't prepared for this. We didn't have weapons, just the basic tools for clearing brush. The figure didn't follow as we backed away, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being tracked. We made it about 50 meters before the woods erupted in noise. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. It wasn't behind us, it was to the side, off to the left, as though whoever it was had taken a different path, cutting us off. We stopped, listening, scanning the trees. I couldn't see anything, but the sounds were getting closer, circling. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. Martin held up his hand, signaling for us to move faster. We tried to stay quiet, but the forest worked against us. Every step broke twigs, disturbed the undergrowth. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I would see that figure again, but the trees were empty. Still, the sounds persisted, coming from all directions now. When we reached the trail, I felt a brief surge of relief. It was familiar ground, easier to navigate, but as we started down the path, I noticed something lying ahead, a small pile of stones carefully stacked. It hadn't been there before. Martin stopped, staring at it. Then he looked back at me, his face grim. He didn't need to say anything. The meaning was clear. Whoever was out there knew the trails, knew where we would go. We moved quickly after that, practically running. The noises didn't stop, though. They followed us, staying just out of sight. Occasionally, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the trees, but it was always fleeting. When we finally reached the main ranger station, I slammed the door behind us and locked it. We radioed for backup, stumbling over our words as we tried to explain what had happened. But as we sat there, the station quiet around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't the only one out there. I kept thinking about the maps, the photographs, all the faces staring back at me, frozen in time, all the places marked with dates and notes. When the backup arrived, we took them to the cabin, but it was empty. The photographs were gone, the maps cleared away. Even the strange figures in the woods had vanished, leaving no trace. We searched the surrounding area for days, but found nothing. No sign of the figure, no sign of the items we'd seen. The forest swallowed it all as though it had never been there. The day was bright, clear skies stretching from one horizon to the other, but it didn't feel like the sort of day you'd want to be outside. There was a stillness in the air that made the forest seem quieter than usual, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe I was letting myself get wound up. Dave hadn't come back. He'd set out on a routine patrol the day before, the kind that should have taken half a day at most. Check the trailheads, clear any debris, make sure no campers were where they shouldn't be. It wasn't like him to stay out past dusk, and certainly not overnight. By morning, when the radio still hadn't picked up his usual crackling report, they'd asked me to head out and check. I packed light, a first aid kit, water, some snacks, and my own radio. Dave knew these trails better than I did, which meant I probably wouldn't need a map. If he'd got turned around somehow, he'd know to stay put and wait for help. That's what we were always told. Stay put, conserve your energy, make yourself easier to find. I started on the southern loop, figuring he'd have taken the usual route. It was wide enough for a vehicle, at least at the beginning, before splitting off into narrower paths that snaked into the denser parts of the forest. The sun cut through the gaps in the canopy, speckling the ground with patches of light. There was nothing unusual about the trail, no signs of a struggle, no broken branches or scraps of clothing. The forest felt normal, apart from the quiet. I told myself it was just the time of day. Birds take breaks, don't they? I called out now and then, though not too often. The sound of my own voice seemed wrong here, as though it didn't belong. There was no answer, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves. The farther I walked, the more the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and blackened as if by an old fire. The ground was softer here, covered in moss that squelched underfoot. I stopped to check my bearings, glancing at the compass clipped to my jacket. It pointed south, the direction I'd been heading, though the path didn't look familiar anymore. I found the first piece of his gear near a fork in the trail. It was his water bottle, still half full, lying in the dirt with the cap screwed on tight. It wasn't like him to leave something like that behind. I picked it up and called his name again, louder this time. The trees absorbed the sound, swallowing it before it could travel far. I kept going, scanning the ground for more signs of him. About 100 meters further on, I found his pack. It was leaning against a tree as though he'd set it down for a break. The straps were loose and the flap was open, but everything inside looked intact. His map, his torch, a spare jacket. Nothing out of place except for the fact that he wasn't there. The quiet was deeper now, the kind that made your ears strain for any hint of noise. I crouched by the pack, looking around for footprints or scuffs in the dirt. There were some faint marks, maybe from his boots, leading away from the tree and into the undergrowth. I followed them. The trail wasn't much of a trail anymore, just a faint line through the ferns and fallen leaves. The trees grew taller here, their branches weaving together to block out most of the sunlight. The air smelled damp, like earth and decay, though there was no sign of rain. The boot prints ended abruptly near a small clearing. I scanned the area, turning slowly in a circle, my hand resting on the strap of my pack. The clearing was empty except for a pile of stones in the center, stacked neatly, too neatly to be natural. I moved closer, my boots crunching over twigs and leaves. The stones were damp, streaked with mud and something darker. It looked like a cairn, the kind people build to mark a trail or a grave. There was no reason for it to be here, not on this patrol route. I turned away from the stones, looking back towards the trees. That's when I noticed the radio. It was lying half buried in the dirt, its antenna bent, the casing scratched. I picked it up, brushing off the mud. The power light flickered weakly when I pressed the button, but there was no signal, just static. I tried not to panic. Radios break, batteries die. It didn't mean anything. The forest around me was darker now, though I hadn't noticed the light fading. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. I stuffed the radio into my pack and retraced my steps to the clearing's edge, but the boot prints were gone. The path I'd followed had vanished, swallowed by the forest. I stood there for what felt like minutes, turning in slow circles, trying to orient myself. Every direction looked the same, tall, blackened trees stretching endlessly into the distance. The cairn loomed behind me, its stones damp and glistening. I picked a direction at random and started walking. My compass needle spun uselessly, refusing to settle. The ground sloped downward, the moss giving way to slick mud that clung to my boots. I found another piece of his gear near a shallow stream. It was his hat, the brim crushed and bent. The stream was barely a trickle, the water dark and stagnant. I knelt to pick up the hat, my hand shaking. The forest was silent now, not just quiet silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant bird calls. Just the sound of my own breathing, harsh and ragged in the stillness. I kept moving, though the light was fading fast. The trees pressed closer together, their trunks black and twisted. The air grew colder, the dampness seeping through my jacket. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of dark trees and soft squelching ground. The cairn appeared again, though I was sure I'd been walking in a straight line. The stones were different now. They were taller, the stack higher, and the mud streaking them was fresh. I turned away and kept walking. The cairn appeared again. I'd been working as a park ranger in Ashcroft National Forest for over 5 years when things started to change. The forest was sprawling, endless in some places, with thick canopies of trees that swallowed the sunlight even on bright days. It was peaceful mostly, quiet trails, families camping in the designated areas, and the occasional wildlife sighting that kept everyone on their toes. But peaceful doesn't mean uneventful. The first time I came across him was in the autumn, a few miles off the northern loop where the trees grow taller, denser. There was no trail out there, not really. I'd gone off path to check on reports of someone camping illegally. You'd hear about these sorts of folks every so often. Runaways, drifters, survivalists who wanted nothing to do with civilization. Most of them left when you asked, though not always cheerfully. I spotted his camp tucked into a hollow near a grove of pines. The tent was old, patched together with bits of tarpaulin and duct tape. There were small tools scattered about, a knife, a tin plate, a makeshift fishing spear, and a fire pit made of stones with a fresh pile of ashes. He was sitting beside it, hands resting on his knees, staring at me like he'd known I was coming for hours. He looked weathered. Grey hair fell in greasy strands around a face that hadn't seen a razor in years. His clothes were threadbare, layered in a way that seemed more for armor than warmth. His eyes, though, there was something about the way they darted, scanning everything at once. I gestured to him that he'd need to pack up, move on. He didn't respond, just sat there staring. I waited, expecting some kind of argument, but he finally stood, gathered his things, and walked deeper into the woods without a word. Something about the encounter left me rattled. People usually pleaded their case or cursed you out. He just left. The next time I was near that area, I noticed the camp had been moved, but only a few hundred meters away. It was as though he'd stayed just far enough to avoid me, but close enough to let me know he wasn't going anywhere. This happened again and again every few weeks until I started to think of him as a permanent resident. He never made trouble, though, so I didn't push it. Maybe I should have. That winter, reports started coming in about missing campers. Not a lot, just 1 or 2 cases at first. People who'd gone hiking and never returned to their campsites. Search parties were organized, but the forest is vast, and the snow complicates things. A couple of disappearances could be chalked up to accidents or people getting lost, but by spring the numbers had grown, too many to ignore. It was around then that I saw him again, the hermit. I'd been patrolling a trail and spotted him standing at the edge of a clearing, half hidden behind the trees. He didn't move when he saw me. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me to approach or daring me to come closer. I shouted for him to stay where he was, but he turned and vanished into the woods. I thought about going after him, but decided against it. Something in his posture made my stomach churn. I turned back towards the station, telling myself I'd log it and follow up later. The disappearances continued. Families started cancelling their camping trips, and the regular hikers, the ones you'd see every weekend without fail, stopped coming altogether. The forest felt different. The usual sounds of birds and wind in the branches were muted, replaced by long stretches of silence. Even the animals seemed to be avoiding the deeper parts of the park. One evening, I was patrolling near the northern loop when I noticed something hanging from a tree ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a bundle of sticks and feathers, bound together with twine and smeared with something dark. It swayed gently in the breeze, creaking faintly. I found more of them over the next hour, hanging from branches, stuck into the ground, arranged in strange patterns near the edges of the trails. They weren't there to scare off animals, that much was clear. They felt like warnings, though I couldn't tell who or what they were meant for. I didn't sleep well that night, and the next morning I went back to the grove where I'd seen his camp months before. It was empty now, though the remains of a fire pit were still visible, along with faint footprints leading deeper into the forest. I followed them for hours, further than I'd ever gone before. The trees grew taller, their branches so thick overhead that they blocked out the sun entirely. It felt like stepping into another world. Well, eventually I came to a clearing where the ground was bare, the grass and soil stripped away to expose raw earth. There were more of those stick figures here, arranged in a circle around the perimeter. In the center of the clearing was a large flat stone stained with something dark and sticky. I didn't stay long. When I got back to the station, I reported what I'd found, but the response was lukewarm. The higher-ups didn't want to close the park. Not during the busy season. They told me to document everything and leave it at that. I tried not to think about the clearing, but I found myself dreaming about it almost every night. About the stone, the figures, and the deep, echoing silence that filled the air. The last time I went out there, I didn't plan to. It was late, and I was the only one on duty when a call came in about strange lights in the forest. The caller didn't give much detail, just that they'd seen something flickering near the northern loop. I grabbed my torch and headed out, more annoyed than anything. I dealt with plenty of false alarms before. Overexcited campers mistaking fireflies for something more sinister. The trail was quiet as I walked, the only sound my boots crunching against the dirt. When I reached the area, I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a faint glow ahead, just past a cluster of trees. It wasn't fire, it was cold and dim, like moonlight reflected on water. As I stepped closer, the glow flickered, shifting and spreading through the trees like a ripple. I froze, unsure of what I was looking at. My pulse quickened as the light began to move, sliding through the branches and out of sight. I turned back the way I'd come, walking faster than I probably should have. The forest behind me felt alive, but not in a way I'd ever experienced before. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I haven't been back to the northern loop since. I haven't gone looking for the hermit either. Something's changed in the park. I don't know what, and I don't think I want to. The tour through the caves was routine, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times without thinking twice. A group of 8, 4 adults and 4 teenagers, had booked the midday slot. It was a private booking, which meant more control but also more pressure. Families like these always expected a bit of showmanship, a touch of flair as I guided them through the network of tunnels beneath the park. The entrance to the caves was cool and damp, a relief from the summer heat above. I ran through the safety checks as usual, helmets, lights and spare batteries, and led them down the initial slope. The group chattered behind me, their voices bouncing off the rock walls, the echoes strangely muted. The caves were old. I'd read somewhere that they'd been carved out by ancient underground rivers, though now the water only trickled through in places. The main paths were wide and stable, well lit by the group's torches. The air smelled faintly metallic, the scent growing stronger as we descended. We stopped at the first chamber, a spacious dome with a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow. I gave them the usual spiel about stalactites and stalagmites, pointing out formations with names like the cathedral and the organ pipes. They oohed and ahed in the right places, snapping pictures that would all look the same later. From there, we moved into narrower passages. I kept the pace steady, pausing now and then to let the slower ones catch up. The rock walls pressed closer together, the ceiling dipping so low we had to duck in places. The air grew cooler and droplets of water clung to the stone, glinting in the torchlight. We were about an hour into the tour when it happened. The sound hit first, a deep rolling rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls shuddered, sending a rain of dust and small stones down on our heads. Before I could shout a warning, the tunnel ahead of us collapsed in a deafening roar. The dust was so thick I could barely see, my torch beam slicing through it like a knife. I turned, counting heads, making sure everyone was still there. They were huddled together, their faces pale and streaked with grime. The way forward was gone, buried under a wall of rubble. The air was clogged with dust, gritty and choking. I gestured for everyone to move back, steering them towards a larger space where we could regroup. The main tunnel was blocked, but I knew these caves well. There were side passages, less stable but navigable. If we could find one that looped back towards the entrance, we might have a chance of getting out. I led them into a narrow passage, the walls close enough that my shoulders brushed them as I walked. The air felt damper here, colder. The sound of water dripping echoed faintly, the only noise apart from our footsteps. The ground sloped downward, the incline steeper than I remembered. I hesitated, the group pressing behind me, their breathing loud in the stillness. The passage twisted and turned, the walls rougher now, the floor slick with moisture. We emerged into another chamber, smaller than the first, but large enough to accommodate us all. A shallow pool of water covered the floor, rippling faintly. The rock above us was jagged, thin streams of water seeping through in places. The air felt wrong. I checked my watch, though it was more out of habit than anything else. The seconds ticked by, each one loud in my ears. One of the teenagers pointed towards the far side of the chamber, where a narrow crevice split the wall. It was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I moved closer, shining my torch into the gap. The beam reflected off something wet and dark, another passage, maybe leading upwards. I didn't have many options. The water in the chamber was rising, creeping up over my boots. It wasn't much, not yet, but the flow was steady. If it kept rising, this space would become a trap. I gestured for the group to follow, one by one, through the crevice. It was tight, the kind of space that made your chest tighten just looking at it. The rock scraped against my sides as I pushed through, the light from my torch bouncing wildly. The passage opened into another tunnel, smaller and more rugged than the ones we'd come through before. It sloped upward, a good sign, though the ground was uneven and littered with loose stones. The air felt thicker, damp and heavy in my lungs. As we moved, I became aware of something strange. The echoes had changed. The sound of our footsteps didn't bounce back the way it should have, as if the walls were swallowing the noise. Then the light from my torch flickered. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it down, focusing on the ground ahead. The tunnel seemed endless, curving and twisting in ways that made no sense. I kept expecting it to turn back towards the surface, but it just went deeper. The water was rising faster now, ankle deep and icy cold. I stopped, turning to the group, but they were gone. I blinked, the torch beam shaking in my hand. The passage behind me was empty. I called out, the sound swallowed by the silence. I pressed on, the water climbing higher with each step. The torch flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw something in the dark ahead. A glint of movement, a shape just beyond the reach of the light. I kept moving, though I couldn't say why. The passage grew narrower, the walls pressing in until I was crawling, the water soaking through my clothes. The light failed completely. I don't know how long I've been here. The sound of dripping water is constant, a steady rhythm that seems to echo inside my skull. The air is so damp it feels like I'm breathing water. The tunnel doesn't end. The smoke was the first sign of trouble. It was just a faint grey smudge against the horizon as I stood on the fire tower scanning the treetops. I'd seen wildfires before. They weren't uncommon in summer with dry conditions and careless campers, but this one felt different. The column of smoke was thin, straight and out of place, smack in the middle of Brightwood's densest area, far from any designated campsites. I grabbed my pack and set out. The trail was narrow and winding, my boots crunching on the dried-out earth. The smell of burning wood grew stronger as I went, mingling with the usual pine and damp undergrowth. It wasn't long before I started to see the telltale signs: blackened leaves floating lazily to the ground, faint crackles in the distance. The fire wasn't large yet, but it was spreading fast. The wind had picked up, and the forest floor was as dry as old paper. As I got closer, I came across something that stopped me cold. A pile of branches stacked neatly against a tree trunk, scorched and still smouldering. This wasn't nature taking its course. Someone had done this. The branches were arranged deliberately, the ground around them swept clean as if to focus the fire on that one spot. Nearby, the bark of the tree bore fresh gouges, like something had scraped against it. I radioed the station and reported what I'd found. Then I checked my map. There was a campsite not far from here, a spot popular with families. If the fire spread in their direction, they'd be in trouble. I headed that way, taking care to keep my footing on the uneven ground. The campsite was empty when I arrived, but it looked recently abandoned. A tent sagged in the middle of the clearing, its poles half collapsed. There was a campfire ringed with stones, the ashes still warm. A water bottle lay on its side, contents leaking into the dirt. Something had scared them off. I scanned the area looking for any sign of which way they'd gone, but all I found were a few stray footprints leading deeper into the woods, straight towards the smoke. I debated whether to follow or double back to the station, but the thought of people out there, maybe unaware of how close the fire was, made the decision for me. I followed the footprints, my heart thudding harder with every step. The smoke was thicker now, stinging my eyes and filling my nose. The fire was growing, I could tell, even without seeing the flames. That's when I found the second stack. Another pyramid of branches, this time fully ablaze. The heat hit me like a slap, and I had to back away, shielding my face. The trees around it were starting to catch, their leaves curling and blackening. Whoever had built this one had used more fuel, dead grass and bits of cloth that smelled acrid as they burned. Nearby, I spotted something that made my stomach churn, a red jerry can, half empty and lying on its side. Someone was out here, lighting these fires on purpose. And they were doing it methodically, cutting off escape routes and driving the flames towards the heart of the forest. I felt exposed standing there, so I pressed on, following the trail. It was harder now. The fire had started to spread and the heat was oppressive. I could hear the occasional crack of a branch giving way, the sound sharp and violent. I thought about turning back more than once, but I kept going. That's when I found the campers. They were huddled near a rocky outcrop, 3 of them, 2 adults and a child. They looked exhausted, their faces streaked with soot. They didn't seem injured, but they were clearly trapped. The fire was closing in, cutting them off from the main trail. I waved to get their attention and gestured for them to follow me. We moved quickly, sticking to the clearer paths where the fire hadn't reached yet. The wind was unpredictable, sending embers swirling around us. At one point, the child stumbled, and I had to double back to help them up. The heat was unbearable now, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. I could feel my lungs straining with every step. Then I saw it, another pile of branches, stacked and waiting. But this one wasn't burning yet. Whoever had been setting the fires was nearby. My stomach twisted as I realized we weren't alone. I didn't have time to think about it. The fire was all around us now, and the campers were flagging. I led them towards a stream I knew was close by, hoping it would act as a barrier. We reached it just as the flames started to consume the trees behind us. The water was shallow, barely enough to get our boots wet, but it was something. We followed the stream until we found a break in the fire line. I urged the campers to keep moving towards the ranger station while I stayed back to check for anyone else who might be trapped. That's when I spotted the figure. They were standing on the other side of the stream, barely visible through the haze. They wore a dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that cast their face in shadow. One hand clutched a canister, while the other held something long and thin, maybe a branch or a metal rod. They didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for me to react. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I turned and ran, following the stream back towards the station. My legs felt like they would give out, and my lungs burned from the smoke, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I collapsed onto the grass, coughing and gasping for air. The fire crews arrived not long after, and the blaze was eventually contained, and they never found the person responsible. When I signed up for ranger duty in Brightwood Forest, I thought I knew what I was getting into. Long hours, solitary patrols, the occasional hiker needing a rescue or a lecture about fire safety, mundane stuff. It was peaceful, which suited me fine. I liked the idea of days filled with birdsong and the crunch of boots on pine needles. That peace shattered the morning I stumbled across the abandoned campsite. I was doing my rounds, hiking along a path rarely used by visitors. It snaked through dense thickets and around rocky outcrops before opening into a small, hidden clearing. I almost missed the spot. The tent, if you could still call it that, was slumped over, like something had clawed through it, but the tiers weren't jagged. The material looked sliced, cleanly and efficiently, as though a blade had done the job. Scattered around the remnants of the tent were belongings: a pair of boots, a half-empty backpack, a torch, and a journal with its pages fluttering in the breeze. The scene wasn't right. Campsites always carry a sense of human presence, even when abandoned. Charred logs from a fire, the faint whiff of smoke, or food wrappers left behind. This one was eerily sterile. The boots sat neatly next to each other, the backpack unzipped but not rummaged through. Even the journal, though open, didn't have the usual water damage you'd expect if it had been left there long. It was as if whoever owned these things had just vanished mid-motion. I radioed the station, described what I was looking at, and logged the location. Protocol was clear: stay put, wait for backup, but I didn't like standing around doing nothing. The surrounding area was so silent that my own breathing sounded intrusive. I decided to poke around the perimeter, not venturing too far, but enough to get a sense of the land. The trees were dense here, their trunks close enough together to form a natural maze. It wasn't a place anyone would camp unless they were lost or hiding. About 20 yards from the clearing, I noticed impressions in the undergrowth, flattened ferns and snapped twigs forming a rough path. Something had moved through here recently. I followed the trail, half expecting to find an animal den or worse, signs of a struggle. Instead, I found him. The man stood among the trees, facing away from me. His clothes were rumpled, a few tears in his shirt exposing pale skin underneath. He wasn't moving, no swaying, no shifting his weight. His arms hung limp at his sides, his head slightly cocked. I called out to him, not that I thought he'd hear me. I stayed still, watching for any sign of life. He turned. His face was blank, not just in expression, but in its total absence of recognition. His eyes held no spark of awareness, no flicker of fear or relief. His lips moved like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Slowly, he raised one hand to shield his eyes, as though warding off sunlight, even though the forest canopy above blocked most of the sky. It was only then that I noticed his pupils, wide, swallowing nearly all the color from his irises. I stepped back, unnerved, and tripped over a branch, landing hard on my elbow. The man didn't react, didn't flinch. He just kept standing there, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. When I found my footing again, I approached cautiously, my radio in hand. As I got closer, his lips stopped moving and he lowered his hand. It was like he'd shut down, frozen in place, even though his eyes still tracked something I couldn't see. I asked him what had happened, where the others were. His mouth twitched slightly, his first real reaction, and he whispered, if you could call it that, a single phrase I didn't catch at the time. All I managed to gather was something about light, bright light. I checked him for injuries, but didn't find anything apart from a few shallow scratches on his forearms, as if he'd been running through the brambles. His pulse was steady, and his breathing seemed normal. Physically, he was fine. Mentally, though, I couldn't say the same. I led him back to the clearing, or tried to. He followed, but his movements were sluggish and jerky, like he wasn't entirely in control of his body. Back at the campsite, I made him sit on a log while I radioed for backup again, this time with more urgency. Then I noticed something. The journal was gone. I'd seen it only minutes earlier, pages fluttering like trapped moths in the breeze. But now the ground where it had been was bare. I searched the area quickly, but there was no sign of it. The man hadn't moved from the log. When the backup team arrived an hour later, the man had stopped responding altogether. They loaded him onto a stretcher, though he didn't resist. We searched the area extensively that day and for the next week, but there was no sign of the others, no tracks leading away, no belongings left behind, not even a name to put to the man we'd found. He had no ID on him, and when he regained some of his faculties days later, he couldn't tell us much. His memory was gone, apart from fragmented flashes of a bright, searing light. The strangest part, he didn't remember camping, didn't even know why he was in the forest to begin with. The investigation closed after a month, though unofficially we kept our eyes open for new leads. None came.